Hello and welcome. I'm Jeanfarish and this is FLossTube number 47. It's hard to believe that soon it will be a year since I started this whole crazy idea, and I am so glad that you've come along for the ride. Today I'm going to catch you up on all of my works in progress. Now for me, this is both stitching works in progress and also some design works in progress. And I'm going to start with Jane Hattersley, which is a stitch along that started back in April. And we have got hundreds of people all across the country and around the world that are stitching this project. An idea came up about how to stitch one of the divider borders that I want to share with you. Now this is an idea that's going to work on any two-color border, but when Allison posted in our JFN Stitch Along group on Facebook, she was talking specifically about this border right here. And she said that by threading two needles, one for each of the two colors, that she found it easier to keep track of where she's going. So I'm going to replicate what Allison did using two similar but different colors. So let me get that set up for you. So again, the color doesn't really matter, but here I've got one needle threaded with kind of taupe color, and another with a red. So in this pattern, you're doing two stitches next to each other. And this type of stitching, I like using the Victorian method, and I work from right to left. Now this will also work with the Danish or the English method, so it's not peculiar just to working with the Victorian method. So I'm going to stitch a total of, 4 complete stitches. And then as I start the 5th stitch, I'm going to park this red thread. So once I get to this point, I'm just going to leave my thread up here. Now I like to park on the face of the fabric just so that I don't get it tangled up on the back, which I did. The taupe I had already parked on the back just to make it look cleaner when I got started, but that's not what I normally do. So then when I start the taupe part, again, I'm going to stitch 4 complete stitches, and then when I start the 5th one is when I'll park. So I'll get half of that. Whoops, sorry, I was so excited about my stitching I wasn't watching where the camera was. So then once I get that 5th stitch started, then I'm just going to park it out of the way here and pick up the red and finish that stitch number 5 in the pattern, and then bring my thread down here to start the process again. This is an easier way to stitch without making counting mistakes when you have this type of a border. Because frankly, if you tried stitching all of one color and then going back and filling in the other, there are a couple of sort of optical illusions that happen with this that makes it easy to make a mistake. So again, when you get to that last stitch in the pattern, this one happens to have 5 stitches. If it were more, then I would stitch until it made sense to stop. But by only doing half of the last stitch and parking your thread on the front, then you're not going to get tangles in the back. And that's really the only reason for doing it that way. So I really appreciate the fact that Allison shared that idea with everybody on our Facebook group. And when you're stitching one of my designs, I encourage you to join that group. It is really a stitch along for any one of my patterns. And that's really the only kind of, I don't know, parameter for the group, is that whatever we discuss needs to be something that relates to something that I have designed. So we get lots of good questions, lots of good suggestions. And I think that some friendships get formed by people who are posting something and somebody else responds to it, and then they find out they have something in common, and then the next thing you know, a new friendship has blossomed. And that just makes me happy. Next up is the Bison and the Elk. Now this is a new design for me. It's part of what I call my ampersand series. There's the deer and the grapes, which we'll talk about again in just a minute, the bear and the moose, and the hare in the basket. So this makes the fourth one, the Bison and the Elk. And my inspiration for this is a trip that I'll be taking in the fall, in September, with, I don't know, a couple dozen. There must be, I don't know, I know it's over 30, but somewhere between 30 and 40 stitchers and their friends, family, whomever that they like to travel with are coming along with us. And we're going to be visiting some incredible natural scenery and national parks in the Southwest. And so that's really the inspiration for this design. Now, where I am with this is I couldn't wait to stitch the elk, which is this guy right here. I am really happy with how he's coming together. I know that you like it when I talk about my design process, so this kind of gives me the chance to talk about how the designing and the stitching are integrated as far as the way I do it. Since the bison and the elk are the main players in this piece, I needed to get them stitched before I started doing a lot of the other motifs, because frankly the other colors could be almost anything, but the bison and the elk, I really needed to make sure that the colors for each one look good and that they look good together. Now, I still haven't stitched this poor guy's horn yet. And that's because, again, that color, it's not inconsequential, but it could be one of many different colors. And so I can put that off for a while. Now, even though I wanted very much to get the elk stitched, I am not a stitcher who likes to count over from, like, say, this point in the bison over and down to, say, this stitch in the elk's horns and go from there. That kind of counting makes me very nervous. So how do I combat that then if I don't want to take the chance of miscounting over an empty area like that? Well, I already had this part of the interior border started, so I went on and stitched all the way over. I had this part of the outside border done. I stitched these three little motifs, and by the way, yes, I carried from one to the other. I did not stop and start. I then stitched the eagle and this tree, and then from the base of the tree, I actually started in this part of the elk. And also my stitching method here was to stitch kind of, I stitched, say, this part of the moose, and then this part of the blue, and then this part, etc., and kind of worked across. I did not carry my brown threads from one side to the other. I don't mind showing you the back. So this is what the back of my piece looks like. That's where I am with the bison and the elk. And one of the things that's just a whole lot of fun for me as I'm stitching this is I've kind of found some YouTube videos about the national parks and just sort of scenery of the Southwest. I do find that if I'm watching something really compelling or something I really have to pay attention to the dialogue, I don't get as much stitching done. So that sort of defeats the purpose. But it's kind of been fun for me to kind of look ahead and get kind of a preview of what we're going to be seeing on this trip while I'm stitching this piece. Now, the folks that are coming on the trip will have this as an optional stitch along. So they'll get to stitch it while we're actually seeing those scenes in person. So that's kind of exciting. And actually, I want to add just a little comment to that. Somebody posted kind of a really sweet comment on Facebook about how she thought it would be kind of hard to stitch with all this gorgeous scenery around, and wouldn't that sort of, I don't know, take away from the trip's experience. You know, none of us, as much as we joke that we could stitch 24/7, none of us can. So my plan on a trip like this is I'll stitch during my downtime. If I'm one of the first people on the bus and I've gotten myself settled and we've got 10 or 15 minutes while we're waiting for other people to board the bus, I might spend that time stitching. If we are caught in traffic and I've already seen the scenery around me and we're going to be on the bus for another 15 minutes and say stop and go traffic or whatever, then yes, I'll spend that time stitching. And of course, after we get back to the hotel each day, I hope to find a really cozy place in the lobby and stitch. So I really feel like that, you know, it's not going to be like going to a retreat where there's a ballroom in a convention center or a hotel or whatever, where you're sitting around with your friends and you are literally stitching all day long and chatting and snacking and just enjoying yourself. It's not that type of a trip. But as we're going from point A to point B to point C each one of the days, I really think that there's going to be time for some casual stitching. But I think the thing that has the most value to me is that when we are all done, and of course I'm going to have mine done ahead of time, but once a person on the trip is finished with their stitching, it becomes a memento, it becomes a souvenir of that trip and an opportunity to recall the scenery that we saw and the friendships that are made on the trip. So that's what's going on with this. As of the time that I'm making this tape, I understand that I think there's still a couple more spots open. There's not many. And yeah, so, and by the way, this is the trip that starts with a visit to the attic needlework store. So that's going to be a real treat too. It'll be my first time. And I have a feeling that for many people on the trip, it'll be their first visit to the attic as well. So that's what's going on with this work in progress. So the next work in progress at this point is a design in progress. I haven't started the restitch yet, but I'm making an adaptation of my own sampler. This is the Deer and the Grapes, and this was a stitch along, a mystery stitch along back in 2015. And I am now adapting it to go with the Redwoods, Rails, and Winery trip. So here's my plan for this particular project. Rather than restitching the whole thing, I'm just going to restitch that center area where the verse is and choose a verse that is more in keeping with this trip. When the people on the trip get the chart pack, and I think even going forward as I publish this, people will have an option of either the verse I started with or this new verse. It's new as far as the sampler's concerned. It certainly isn't new in terms of the writing of it because it's from John Muir. Now, when I asked my viewers out there to give me some ideas about some verses that would work, this is an idea that came from Julie Scott, and I really do appreciate this. It's a John Muir quote. And here's how the revised verse will read. Keep close to nature's heart and break clear away once in a while and climb a mountain or spend a week in the woods. Now at this point, I'm not really happy with the spacing. I wanted to keep some of the same motifs and as much as possible keep them in the same position. So the grapes, the little bird, the deer, and these tall sort of funky flowers are all still in the same location they were in on the original 2015 version. And I may end up adding a few other little things to fill the spaces, like these quilt style star motifs. And also I'm thinking the crown looks a little skimpy, so I might replace that with a different style crown. So that's where I am right now. I'm not happy with the spacing, as I said, and I find that that's always the hardest part with a sampler like this, a motif sampler, where you're trying to get the words to fit with the motifs, and you want the language, the breaks and the phrasing to be in the right places. And sometimes the quote is slightly too long, and sometimes it's too short. And this is always a struggle for me. Those of you who quilt, I think, can appreciate the point I'm at right now. If you've ever had one of those project walls, or I've used my dining room table or whatever, where I've laid a quilt out, and I just tell myself, if every time I walk through the dining room, I'm moving quilt blocks around, then that tells me I'm still not satisfied with it. But if I can walk through that room 2 or 3 days, and each time not feel compelled to nudge something over or to swap blocks or whatever, that tells me that I'm feeling good about the way the colors are interacting with each other, and all the various design elements. So again, that's where I am right now. And I'd like to say I'll just sleep on it, but it's not a matter of sleep. It's just a matter of there being time and space and being able to come back to it with fresh eyes. And sometimes you can see a solution to a design quandary that you couldn't see previously. Frankly, I got so wrapped up in trying to solve this problem. That is one of the reasons why this whole episode was delayed and wasn't posted early this morning like I usually do. So so that's where I am with the revised Deer and the Grapes, which is going to be the stitch-along project for the Redwoods, Rails, and Winery tour in October. So that's coming up faster than I realized. When John and Ray and I started planning these 2 trips, it seemed so far in the future. And now it's like, wow, it's just, it's right at the end of summer. It's going to be great. I can't wait. Next up is the Melbourne Sampler. And this is one I've talked with you all about before. I needed to revise it because the dye lot for the water lilies that I used in this main area of the sampler, the colors change, and I understand that. I mean, I know that when you're talking about a hand-dyed item, that you're not always going to get the exact same shades. And with a project like this, all the other colors build on that main color that I pulled from the water lilies. So it became really important to me to find some way to stabilize that line. So this is a line that I knew all along I would have to rip out and restitch. And I kind of figured, well, I'll either do it in one of the greens or one of the pinks, and that'll solve the problem. But actually it didn't. I didn't like the way it looked. And I frankly wish I had taken a photo of it so I could share that with you, but I didn't. So after seeing the original and how that one row just sort of, to me, just kind of made the sampler, then I really needed to find a way to solve that problem. So I thought, well, since it's a 2-step stitch, it's called the interlaced cross stitch. And frankly, I'm not going to demonstrate it to you right now because it's part of the class. But what I found when I stitched that stitch with 2 colors, it ended up just looking muddy. When you looked at it close up, you could see the 2 distinct colors. But when you stepped away from it, it just looked like, it just looked muddy. It didn't look like anything. So that part I had to rip out. And so then I thought, well, you know what? This is kind of tedious and it will take extra time and extra care. But let's take a look at how I ended up solving the problem. So what we're going to do here is to stitch part of it in, say, both steps in the pink, and then the pink and the ecru, and then the pink and the green, and then the green and the pink, and then green and green, and then green and pink, and then pink and green, and then pink and white, and then pink and pink, etc., going across the row. So that is how I ended up solving that particular problem. And of course, people in the class that might say, well, that's too much trouble, I don't want to do it, then they can stitch that in all pinks or all greens. The other change I needed to make, and I just remembered as I was looking at this, I still have one more step to do. This diamond shape in the original was stitched in a number 8 pearl cotton, and I really felt it was slightly too bulky, so I ripped that out and redid it in 2 strands of the ecru. And it also needs to be back stitched around this in the taupe color, and I forgot about that. I'm glad I remembered now, because I'm planning on getting this pinned to the piece of foam core as soon as I'm finished with today's episode. The other change I had to make was I realized when I was looking at one of the close-up photos that I had a stitching mistake in my letter T, so I fixed that. And then these 2 rows were also above and below the row of buttons. That was also originally done in that water lilies color. And for those, I decided just to do in the solid taupe color. So these are the changes that I needed to make for this kit to be, this class kit to be something that would be easy for shop owners and guilds to put together. And for me as well, because there are times that I teach this class and I'm the one who produces the kits. When you're stitching with something like any one of the overdyed flosses, this is not unique to, say, water lilies. Anytime you're stitching with something with an overdyed, and it's like the star of the show, then pick that color out first and pick the other colors to go with it. And I think that you'll be happy in the long run, because those colors in the overdyes are going to vary. So rather than being frustrated by it, just embrace it and say, okay, let me start with the overdyed and then pick the floss colors that match the overdye. And design-wise, I think you'll be happy with it in the long run. Again, in terms of kit production, that just becomes a nightmare. So that's both my advice and the solution that I worked out for this particular design that I think in the long run we're all going to be happy with. So again, the other project that's been very much on my mind this week has been Lady Elizabeth. Now this is sort of a class, but it doesn't have to be an in-person class. I can teach it as an in-person class, but this is set up to be one that you can follow the tutorials and learn this variety of white work stitches on your own. So at this point, obviously the design is done, the original is stitched. So why is it back on my list of things to do? So at this point, this is the restitch, and it doesn't look very exciting, obviously. But before I can do the tutorials, I need to get like this framework stitched, and then I can sit down and do the video tutorials for each one of the stitches in the various sections. So that's kind of the hang up on this right now, is I need to get this framework done before I can do the fun part. So I'm hoping that by the end of the summer, I'll have this one in my Etsy store, and shops that would like to carry my designs will also have it. And a purchase would give you not only the chart and the stitch diagrams, but also access to the video tutorials. Great opportunity to get together with your stitching friends and just have your own little stitch along where you can work at your own pace, enjoy each other's company, cheer each other on, sympathize when things don't go well, and cheer when things do go well. So that's kind of a fun thing to look forward to. Now, Roxie, of course, is a stitch along that feel like is my constant companion. Very enjoyable companion, very easy to get along with, this Roxie is. She's cheerful and she's bright and she's just a whole lot of fun. I can't show you where I am at this point because come July 1st, the people that are in the Stitch Along group get to see it first. And after that, I'll share with you where we are. But 2 things came up this week. One is a number of people were concerned that the letter P was backwards. It seems that Roxie got a little carried away with the curlicue part of her letter P, and the curlicue is actually bigger than what we think of as being the front end of the letter P. And, you know, I encourage you always, whether it's one of my designs or anyone's designs, if something kind of bugs you like that, then, you know, make a change. That's certainly okay. But the interesting thing I want to share with you, very, very clever, was that one of the participants, her first name is Marion, and her last name begins with a W. She knows who she is. She knows I'm talking about her today. She sent me this photo of her work in progress with this note. She said, I just finished the cursive alphabet and strawberries. I'm enjoying stitching, Roxie. I liked your adaptation of the letter S, then decided to look through my alphabet patterns for a different letter T. You can imagine my surprise when I opened your alphabet treasury from 1985 and I saw the Roxana Corson sampler script and print letters and numbers. I chose to use her original T. I've used alphabets from this book many times over the past years. Thanks. And I appreciate that note so much. Now look with me again at the photo that she sent along with her note. Do you notice anything special about the script alphabet? Doesn't it seem like the M and the W really jump out at you? Your eyes are not playing tricks on you. What Marion did was, after cross-stitching these letters, she went back and backstitched around each one of them, which just gave them just that little bit of an emphasis, sort of like made it bold rather than regular. And I love the fact that it's a very subtle way to personalize it. And obviously, when you have the whole alphabet, you can do that no matter what your initials are. So think about that, whether you're doing it for Roxie or any sampler that you stitch, or anything that's got letters on it. If you can kind of have a little hidden message by making a little subtle stitching change like that, it really makes the piece very individual, something that's unique to you. Whew. So that's it for my works in progress, my designs in progress, my stitching in progress, my plans in progress of what's going on with me. I do want to share a couple FAQs with you. One came in from Iris, and she had this question about hand-dyed fabric. She said that she's never stitched with hand-dyed fabric because she's afraid of washing it. And can we do the same thing with our hand-dyed fabrics that I demonstrated last week with the over-dyed flosses? And the answer is sort of yes. Again, I think that rather than not ever using any one of these lovely fabrics, that I would either, if the piece is large enough that you can cut a small piece off of it and test wash it, and if the color bleeds, but the intensity of the color and the design doesn't fade, then I would wash the whole thing. If you find that your test washing washes some of the color out, but maybe not all of the color, then you have a decision to make. Do you want to be able to wash it and lose some of the color? Or do you want to keep the color the way it was intended and not ever wash it? In which case you're going to have to take some precautions in stitching it. There's no right or wrong decision here. You have to decide what works best for you. So that certainly isn't a comprehensive answer for Iris or anyone else who has had that in the back of their mind, saying, can we apply these same principles that we talked about with the over-dyed floss? Can we do the same things with our over-dyed and processed linens? And I would just say proceed with caution. At this point, I don't have any specific advice to offer for any of them. There are a couple of products that you can research and play around with that quilters use to help stabilize dye. And I'll put that information in my comments or my description for the episode so that you can proceed with them if you would like to. So, and if you have any firsthand experience with stabilizing color in overdyed fabrics, I am happy to hear about it, and you can either email me or put it in the episode comments. But keep in mind that what works for one batch of overdyed fabric may not work for another. So I don't know whether or not there's any kind of universal fix-all for the overdyed fabric market. And I also got an FAQ from Rosemary when she was watching the FLossTube episode about the humbug, which I think was number 27. She said, "This is a cute little item, but I just don't get the concept of having a scissor fob. I suppose it's just decorative. Loved watching you put the humbug together." So my response to Rosemary about any sort of a scissor fob is that I like the three-dimensional kind, what I call the fat chubby kind, because I stitch very often on a couch or chair, and if I'm not careful, my scissors will slide down between the cushions. And when I'm in a recliner, if it slides down, it can slide down into the mechanism of the recliner. And if anybody's ever tried to move a recliner, they're very, very heavy. So I like the fat kind, because then if my scissor slides down between the cushions, this is not going to fall down in between them. So that's one reason. When you go to stitching retreats or any type of a class, a scissor fob is a good idea, because lots of people are going to have gold stork style scissors. And so your scissor fob becomes an identifier. And finally, I'd like to see them as a form of creative expression. So what one person might say, well, it's just decorative. It's also self-expression. So I like scissor fobs because I just think they're neat and they're practical and they're fun, and I like making them. So that brings us to the end of our episode today. I am going to remember to ask you to subscribe. Finally, after weeks and weeks and weeks of forgetting. But I'm always going to remember to remind you to stitch happy and stay safe. And I'll see you here again next week, hopefully on time. Thanks. Bye.